Okay, hi seniors. Today's lesson in modern issues in journalism is just going to talk about issues in bias. And this one's going to be pretty brief because we've talked a lot about bias in the news, a lot about how bias is perceived, a lot about how to navigate bias, a lot about how bias isn't necessarily a bad thing, you just need to know how to understand it. We've done a lot of that before, so this is just going to be a really quick overview and just the way it specifically affects journalism and why it's an issue in journalism. And one of those biggest reasons is because people feel that bias equals bad, basically, that biased news is not reliable, that it's bad news, that because of this, many news sources are not reliable, and that people can't rely on the media for good information anymore. And so that kind of circles back to a lot of those issues we've talked about where people don't have a lot of trust in the media or feel like the media is unreliable, different things like that. And basically the fact of the matter is that yes, a lot of the times news can be biased, especially if you get into big national stories. Local news tends to be a little bit more straightforward. There's not really sides that people are taking and it's not as opinionated, but a lot of times when you get into national news and national coverage of things, people's bias gets involved, and that is okay as long as they're still being factual and as long as they're still being true to what's going on. If you're reporting on politics and on a political maybe a debate, you're going to be really straightforward with your opinion. As long as you're still being honest and still stating the facts about what happened, that's totally fine. And if you're a consumer of information, you just need to know what kind of bias you're going to receive from the sources that you're getting it from. So if you are reading a lot of articles from Fox News, you need to know that you're getting a really right-winged perspective of things, and that you should probably shake things up a little bit if you want to kind of, broaden your horizons. Same goes for if you are someone who only gets your news from MSNBC or CNN. It's going to be a lot more left-winged, and if you want to broaden your horizons that way, you need to start looking at other sources as well. There's nothing wrong with relying on those sources. Most of them actually do give straightforward information, but if you look at a lot of major news sites today, a lot of them are based on kind of opinion articles, or even if they're not opinion, even if they're straightforward news, they're going to be skewed one way or the other, just because that's their right as that platform. You're allowed to give your bias and your opinion, and that's kind of the audience that you're catering to. If you as a consumer have an issue with that, then that's more on you to find multiple articles that talk about the same thing, because you could also just watch the debate yourself if you wanted to get straightforward news on it, but if you want to see how it's impacting the Democratic Party or independent voters or the Republican Party, then you want to look at these different kind of biased news sites. So that's specifically how bias impacts news. We especially see it when it comes to political news. That's why I'm using the example of like the debates, just because that's where people tend to get up in arms and feel like media is biased one way or another. And the fact of the matter is, yes, it is, and that shouldn't stop you from consuming media. Yes, there are many times when people can use their biases to be unfactual or to report information that isn't necessarily contextually true or that isn't true to what's going on. That is a problem. The problem with bias comes in when it kind of breaks the boundaries of journalism ethics, which is something we've also talked about. But as long as your bias is staying true to what's actually happening, you're being honest, you're not leaving out important information, you're not leaving out context, you're not straight up lying with what you're saying with your bias, then you're okay. So that's kind of my 2 cents, I guess, on issues and bias when it comes to politics. The reason it's an issue in journalism is obviously just because when people feel like the news they're consuming is too biased, then they are not going to necessarily, like if they feel like it's too biased, then they're not going to want to consume it as a source of information. Sorry, I got distracted because a text popped up on my phone. So that's where it becomes an issue, and part of that is on the side of journalists to acknowledge their bias, but most of that comes down to it's an issue on the consumer's end of things, where we have to learn how to consume media, understanding the bias and being okay with the bias, and learning how to find multiple sources that kind of counteract each other so that we're getting the full picture. So that's kind of how to combat issues and bias when it comes to journalism, and why it's an issue in journalism, and why this is an issue that specifically is more the responsibility of the consumer to address than the journalists themselves. And then another issue in bias is an issue of high versus low coverage. A lot of the times, especially in the US, say there's a perception that the media only covers certain events and disregards other events. And that's also an issue of just like journalism is a business, and we live in a capitalist society. One of the basic rules of capitalism is supply and demand. You can't give people what they're not interested in. And there have been lots of statistics and studies that have shown, and I'll link some of them in the slideshow, that have shown that people are more interested in and more captivated by bad news. So people want to know the negative things that are happening around the world so that they can either just be informed. For some people, if they have anxiety, or different kind of fears like that. It really helps them to know what's going on in the world, exactly where things are happening, so that they can just be totally informed about that. For some people, it's so that they can jump in and help out and do what they can to support it. People just tend to be more interested in the bigger negative things that are happening because those have broader impacts on people than like the good news. So that's just kind of some information. Obviously, it varies depending on what's going on. Right now, this is a huge deal. So most of the news is taken up by COVID-19. You don't really get a lot of news about other stuff that's going on, and that is just basic business. This is what the public is interested in. This is what people want to read about and what they want to know more about. So yes, the media is biased, that they will give more coverage and more attention to certain things than other things, and that is specifically because that's how you cater to your audience's needs. We as the public need to know about COVID-19 right now, and we need to know about maybe stuff that's going on with the current election cycle, stuff that's going on with closures, that kind of thing. There's not a lot of other news that's going on that all of the public needs to know about or really is interested in, and so it's the media's responsibility to cater to our needs in that way by only providing that kind of news. This can be a huge issue if you have a news site that is choosing to only give coverage to things and it becomes like a race issue or a gender issue, and they're only highlighting negative news stories about maybe African Americans. That's an issue that we've seen before that we talked about a little bit with the Hate U Give, where sometimes journalists will use like mugshots of African Americans when they're writing articles about police brutality, stuff like that. That kind of bias is different than coverage bias, but they kind of can be linked together. But coverage bias tends to just be more the public's perception that the media is only giving them bad news or like trying to skew their perception by the information they're giving them. You can perceive it that way, but the fact of the matter is that most of the time with coverage bias, it has to do with what the public wants and how to get that information out to them. However, in the circumstances where we see bias in terms of, highlighting people in a negative way that shouldn't be highlighted in a negative way, or we see race bias or gender bias or that kind of thing come in, then absolutely it's the responsibility of the consumer to call out the journalist and give a ton of backlash toward that article so that they're able to counter that bias and kind of get rid of it. That's when bias is inappropriate, is when it leads to issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, that kind of stuff. So hopefully that makes sense. Bias is kind of a tricky thing because bias isn't necessarily bad until it becomes an issue of ethics and morals. So your bias because you are a Republican or a Democrat doesn't make you necessarily a good or bad person. If your bias is because you are a racist, then obviously that's an ethical issue, and that's when you need to step in and kind of, this is where the line is and you may not cross this. You can't cross that ethical boundary. So that's kind of how to think about bias when it comes to journalism and how to navigate when bias is okay and when it's not okay, and when it's the responsibility of the consumer to handle it and when it's the responsibility of the journalist to handle it. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more information about bias. Again, it's something we've talked about a lot before, so this was a pretty brief overview, but if you have any questions about anything I said, if anything was confusing, if I'm talking too fast, anything like that, just let me know and we can do a little more in-depth information. I hope you're all doing okay. I'm sure most of you are like me, where you're starting to go a little crazy in self-isolation. But I miss all of you. I'm hoping to see you soon. I'm hoping you're not feeling too overwhelmed, and I hope you enjoy your mini spring break. I'll post our final video for Modern Issues in Journalism tomorrow, and then after spring break is when we'll step into our second to last unit, which is going to be over Othello. If we're still online, I'll come up with kind of a way that we're going to do that won't be overwhelming. So let me know if you need anything, if you have any questions. I love you all. Hope you're staying safe and healthy. Thank you for watching. Bye.